Hi friends and companions along this path of spiritual practice. On this day, we are all thinking about policing. I'm thinking about Sherry Maples. 7 years into her 20-year-long career as a police officer, Captain Sherry Maples decided to take her meditation and mindfulness practices further. She wanted to actually travel to Plum Village in France so that she could receive mindfulness trainings directly from Thich Nhat Hanh. One of the requirements to travel to Plum Village and receive those trainings from Thich was for participants to write a letter of interest and intent. And so Maples wrote a letter saying she found it incredibly difficult, almost impossible, with extreme doubt about how to incorporate Thay's teachings into her work as a police officer. How do you practice loving kindness meditation when you have a good sense that this scenario might end with someone getting shot? How do you practice mindfulness and softening your heart when you know that the situation you're entering into is fraught with violence? She wrote all of this in her letter. Thay received and read through the letter, and the next day, Thay delivered a 2-hour-long Dharma talk on the many faces of compassion. And he surprised her and many by saying that it was possible to be a bodhisattva and carry a gun. Maples had come to Plum Village wondering her many questions, whether his teachings could be incorporated into her work as a police officer. And Thich Nhat Hanh put her question to rest by saying in effect to her, who would we want carrying a gun besides someone practiced in mindfulness? Thay went on in that 2-hour-long Dharma talk by talking about the many faces of compassion. He talked about the gentle compassion of understanding. And he talked about the fierce compassion of setting boundaries so that people would be protected, so that even force might come into play to intervene and keep people safe from harm and danger. And he talked about these two bodhisattvas, the gentle bodhisattva of compassion and this fierce bodhisattva of compassion, and the wisdom to know which one was being called for in which particular circumstance. And even more, how these two faces of the bodhisattva of compassion would often need to be combined so that they could be skillfully engaged in situations that police officers ordinarily encounter. Maples was absolutely excited and surprised by Thay's teaching. And she came back to the United States and she began to understand, to reflect, that these teachings could be incorporated into policing. That at a deep level, that how Maples was mindful of her own energy would often impact the energy of others caught in a certain situation. and that the interplay of the energies would allow them to see one another and the situation in a much more expansive way than would violence and fear. Only a few weeks after her return from being on retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, Captain Maples received a domestic violence call, and she responded. She entered the situation where the husband was refusing to return his daughter back to his ex-wife after their time together. And the husband had threatened Captain Maples with violence. But on that particular day, after her time in Plum Village with Thich Nhat Hanh, Captain Maples decided to try something different. She brought her practice into the situation. And she decided to look at this man more expansively. She decided to give time, not to worry about how things were going, other than to be present to him, to ask him what was going on. And she was absolutely stunned to find this man beginning to sob, to weep, as he began to narrate the pain in his heart. She found herself embracing this man, and because no physical violence was done, she chose not to arrest him. 3 days later, while she was shopping in a supermarket in her community, this man ran up to her and gave her a bear hug. And he said to her, "You didn't know that you saved my life that day." Captain Maples is getting at ways that we can see the many faces of compassion, where the gentle bodhisattva and the fierce bodhisattva can come together hand in hand, even in the work of policing. So in the summer of 2003, she actually invited Thich Nhat Hanh to come to Wisconsin for a retreat with police officers and criminal justice professionals. There were more than 50 police officers attending that week-long retreat on the Bodhisattva of compassion. And at the retreat, she expressed, as everyone understood, the crises in policing, how there are complex and multiple dynamics that are intersecting, the unnecessary use of force, racism and racial profiling, the militarization of police departments, the lack of trust between communities and police, the lack of strategies to address trauma and emotional health of community members as well as police officers, the unconscious and often unspoken organizational agreements in the culture of the police, and the lack of safety nets for people everywhere across our country. Captain Maples spoke to these complex and multiple dynamics at play in our current policing. But she spoke about practices, about how police officers as well as community members can engage in practices without which we become desensitized to even the quivering of our hearts when we see the suffering of another, when we actually can't even see the suffering in front of us, is a human being in pain, asking for help. And she asked at the close of the retreat, even as we know that it will take time and great dedication to transform our policing culture, what are ways in which practices of mindfulness and meditation, what are ways that spiritual practices can help us as we move further in policing? How can the badge and the gun be seen not simply as power and authority, but how can the gun and the badge be seen as forms of skillful means? And so, friends, as we continue in our journey of spiritual practice, we hold policing, and we hold Captain Mabel's question of how skillful means might enter into the way that as a community we understand and practice policing.